A group of heavily armed American soldiers stepped out of their helicopters into a quiet Vietnamese hamlet, expecting a brutal firefight, but found only families cooking breakfast. Within 4 hours, those same soldiers would commit an act so devastating it would shake the moral foundation of the United States and change the course of the Vietnam War forever. How did an ordinary unit of young men sent to protect these very civilians transform into a force of systematic destruction in a single morning? The answer lies not in a sudden outbreak of madness, but in a fractured military strategy, a toxic obsession with body counts, and a chain of command that completely lost its way. This is the story of the My Lai Massacre, an event that forced a global superpower to look into a mirror and confront the deepest darkness within its own ranks. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we must look beyond the immediate violence and examine the deep psychological fractures that had been spreading through the American military in the early months of 1968. The soldiers of Charlie Company were young, average Americans, many of them teenagers, who had arrived in Vietnam only months earlier, with dreams of heroism and a desire to serve their country. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a frustrating, invisible war, where the enemy was rarely seen but constantly felt. They walked through dense jungles and muddy rice paddies, watching their friends die one by one from hidden landmines, sniper fire, and booby traps. By the time they received their orders for the mission in Sun Mai village, they were exhausted, terrified, and angry, primed for a confrontation that would spiral completely out of control. This was not an isolated incident of madness, but the culmination of a broken strategy that valued numbers over human lives, and a tragic demonstration of what happens when the rules of engagement are replaced by a desire for revenge. As we retrace the steps of those who walked into the hamlet that morning, we are forced to ask uncomfortable questions about duty, obedience, and the thin line that separates civilization from savagery. This investigation is not merely an exercise in historical finger-pointing, but a necessary journey into a destination's the heart of military ethics, exploring how structural failures can lead to absolute moral collapse on the ground. We must analyze how these young men, who only months prior were high school students and mechanics, became agents of an unspeakable tragedy that would redefine the global perception of the Vietnam War. By analyzing the structural pressures, the training gaps, and the psychological toll of guerrilla warfare, we can begin to understand how ordinary individuals can be led to commit extraordinary atrocities under the banner of military necessity. To comprehend the atmosphere of early 1968, we must understand the profound shock of the Tet Offensive, launched in late January by the North Vietnamese Army and the National Liberation Front. This massive surprise attack struck cities and military bases across South Vietnam. Although the offensive was a tactical, military defeat for the communist forces, it was a massive psychological victory. It shattered the illusion held by the American public and military leadership that the war was nearing an end. In the aftermath of Tet, a sense of desperation and paranoia swept through the American ranks. The province of Quang Ngai, located in the central coastal region of Vietnam, had long been a stronghold of resistance. For years, the region had been heavily contested, and the local population was caught in the crossfire between the Saigon government and the communist guerrillas. The American military command viewed Quang Ngai as a hostile territory where almost everyone was suspected of aiding the enemy. To deal with this stubborn pocket of resistance, the military created Task Force Barker, a temporary unit made up of battalions from the 11th Infantry Brigade. Among these was Charlie Company, commanded by Captain Ernest Medina. Charlie Company had arrived in Vietnam in December 1967. They were highly trained and eager to prove themselves, but their first 3 months in the Dana country were a nightmare of attrition. They suffered dozens of casualties without ever engaging the enemy in a major pitched battle. They lost popular leaders including Sergeant Bill Weber, to a hidden mine just days before the assault on Sun Mai. The soldiers grew increasingly frustrated, unable to retaliate against an enemy that blended seamlessly into the local population. They began to view all Vietnamese civilians with deep suspicion, unable to distinguish between a peaceful farmer and a Viet Cong guerrilla. This toxic mix of grief, fear, and racial animosity created a powder keg waiting for a spark. The military leadership, under pressure to show progress through the grim metric of body counts, began to plan a major sweep of the area codenamed Pinkville, which included the sub-hamlet of My Lai 4. The strategic mindset of the time was clear. If the enemy could not be identified, then the entire population in the enemy's suspected stronghold must be treated as hostile, setting the stage for a catastrophic failure of basic military ethics. This dangerous doctrine of attrition meant that success was measured not by territory held, but by the number of enemy dead, a metric that inevitably blurred the line between combatants and non-combatants in the minds of exhausted soldiers. This pressure cooker environment stripped away the conventional limits of combat, leaving the soldiers of Charlie Company primed to treat every living soul in Sun Mai as a combatant. On the evening of the 15th of March, 1968, Captain Ernest Medina called a briefing for the men of Charlie Company. The intelligence reports they received were highly specific, but catastrophically wrong. The soldiers were told that the 48th Local Force Battalion of the Viet Cong was occupying the hamlet of My Lai 4. They were told that all civilians would have left the village to go to the market by 7 a.m., leaving only the enemy and their active supporters. The orders given that night were filled with aggressive, ambiguous language. Captain Medina told his men to burn the dwellings, kill the livestock, destroy the crops, and pollute the day's wells. When asked directly if this meant killing women and children, Medina's response was interpreted by many of his men as an authorization to destroy everything in the village. Lieutenant William Calley, the commander of the 1st Platoon, took these instructions to heart. The next morning, March 16, began with an intense artillery barrage designed to clear the landing zone. At 7:30 a.m., helicopters carrying the first wave of Charlie Company touched down in the rice paddies outside My Lai. The soldiers leaped from the helicopters, weapons ready, expecting to draw heavy fire. Instead, there was silence. The village was waking up. Women were preparing breakfast, children were playing, and old men were tending to their daily chores. There were no enemy soldiers, no bunkers, and no weapons to be found. Yet, the momentum of the operation could not be stopped. The soldiers, fueled by adrenaline, fear, and weeks of built-up anger, began to sweep through the hamlet. The initial searches quickly turned into acts of random violence. Soldiers kicked down doors, threw grenades into family bomb shelters, and began shooting civilians who tried to run. Lieutenant Calley ordered his men to round up the villagers and herd them into central locations. The confusion of the first few minutes rapidly gave way to a systematic, organized slaughter as the chain of command broke down completely and the dark impulses of war took over. The soldiers did not meet resistance, yet they continued to advance, clearing houses with automatic weapons, fire, and bayonets, treating the defenseless inhabitants as if they were armed combatants in a desperate struggle for survival. No one questioned the absence of incoming fire. The operational plan had assumed an enemy presence, and the soldiers proceeded as if that assumption were an indisputable reality, ignoring the clear evidence before their eyes. This collective suspension of disbelief allowed the unit to execute their orders with a terrifying, mechanical efficiency, completely detached from the reality of the peaceful village they were destroying. By mid-morning, the hamlet of My Lai 4 had become a killing field. In a muddy irrigation ditch on the eastern side of the village, Lieutenant William Calley ordered his men to push dozens of Vietnamese civilians, mostly women, toddlers, and elderly, people into the trench. When one of his soldiers, Private First Class Paul Meadlow, hesitated, Calley yelled at him to start shooting. Together, they opened fire with their automatic rifles, spraying bullets into the crowded ditch until the cries of the wounded fell silent. But as this horror unfolded, on the ground, an unexpected savior appeared from the sky. Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson Jr., a 25-year-old helicopter pilot, was flying a small OH-23 scout helicopter over the village to spot enemy positions. Looking down through the smoke, Thompson did not see an army engaging the enemy. He saw heaps of civilian bodies. He watched in horror as an American officer walked up to a wounded Vietnamese girl and shot her. Realizing that his fellow soldiers were committing mass murder, Thompson decided to act. He landed his helicopter near a group of terrified civilians who were being pursued by American soldiers. Thompson stepped out of his aircraft and confronted Lieutenant Calley, asking what was happening. Calley told him to mind his own business. Thompson, refusing to back down, saw a group of civilians hiding in a nearby bunker with U.S. soldiers approaching them. He turned to his helicopter door gunners, Lawrence Colburn and Glenn Andriotta, and gave a stunning, unprecedented order. If the American soldiers opened fire on the civilians, they were to open fire on the American soldiers. Thompson then coaxed the civilians out of the bunker and called for 2 evacuation helicopters to carry them to safety. He even landed his helicopter again to rescue a small child who was still clinging to life inside the bloody irrigation ditch. In that single act of supreme moral courage, Hugh Thompson and his crew drew a line in the sand, demonstrating that even in the deepest darkness of war, humanity could still find a way to shine. They risked their lives and their careers, not to fight an enemy, but to protect the innocent from their own comrades, establishing a powerful precedent that would later redefine the concept of military honor. This dramatic intervention stood as a stark contrast to the actions of Charlie Company, proving that individual moral agency remains possible even under the most intense systemic pressure. It showed that a single person, armed only with a clear conscience and the courage to act, could stand as a barrier against absolute madness. The immediate aftermath of the massacre was marked by a deliberate and highly successful cover-up. The official military press release described the operation as a major victory, claiming that Charlie Company had killed 128 Viet Cong guerrillas in a fierce battle, with only a few civilian casualties. General William Westmoreland sent a congratulatory telegram to the unit, praising their outstanding job. The truth might have remained buried forever, if not for the conscience of a young soldier named Ronald Ridenour, a helicopter door gunner who had not been present at My Lai but had heard detailed accounts of the slaughter from friends in Charlie Company, was horrified by what he learned. After returning to the United States, he spent months drafting a Buddy Downzo, detailed 3-page letter describing the atrocities. In March 1969, he sent this letter to 30 prominent political and military figures, including President Richard Nixon, the Pentagon, and several members of Congress. His letter sparked a quiet internal investigation by the Army, led by Colonel William Wilson. By late 1969, the evidence was overwhelming, and the Army quietly charged Lieutenant Calley with multiple counts of murder. However, the American public still knew nothing of the crime. That changed on November 12, 1969, when an independent investigative journalist named Seymour Hersh broke the story through the Dispatch News Service. Hersh's detailed reporting, combined with the haunting, graphic photographs taken by Army photographer Ronald Haberly, shocked the world. The images of piles of dead women and children lying in the dirt of My Lai were published in Life magazine, shattering any remaining illusions about the nature of the war and triggering global outrage. The contrast between the official lies and the photographic reality was too stark to ignore. forcing the entire nation to confront the uncomfortable truth that their military was capable of committing the very atrocities they had accused their enemies of perpetrating. This revelation galvanized the anti-war movement, transforming passive skepticism into active resistance across American universities and city streets, as millions realized the deep moral cost of the ongoing conflict. The cover-up had failed, but the damage to the nation's collective psyche was permanent, initiating a period of intense public debate over the ethics of the entire military campaign and the transparency of the government. The shockwaves of this disclosure traveled far beyond America's borders, prompting international allies and adversaries alike to question the basic ethical foundations of the American intervention in Southeast Asia. The revelation of My Lai plunged the United States into a profound crisis of conscience. In 1970, the Army convened the Peer Commission, led by Lieutenant General William Peers, which concluded that organizational failure, a lack of leadership, and a systematic cover-up had occurred at almost every level of the chain of command. Despite these findings, only Lieutenant William Calley was convicted of a crime. In March 1971, a military jury found him guilty of the premeditated murder of 22 Vietnamese civilians and sentenced him to life in prison. However, the public reaction to Calley's conviction was deeply divided. To some, he was a scapegoat who was being punished for carrying out the policy of a brutal war. To others, he was a cold-blooded killer who deserved his sentence. President Richard Nixon intervened, ordering Calley to be released from military prison and placed under house arrest at Fort Benning. Calley ultimately served only 3.5 years of house arrest before being paroled. The legacy of My Lai extends far beyond the courtroom. It forced the United States military to fundamentally reevaluate its training, its ethics, and its rules of engagement. It led to the creation of the Law of Armed Conflict training programs, which emphasize that soldiers have a legal and moral duty to disobey unlawful orders. For the American public, My Lai was a turning point that accelerated the anti-war movement and destroyed the moral authority of the war effort. It showed that when an army loses its moral compass, it can become its own worst enemy, inflicting wounds on its own national identity that take generations to heal. The trial and its aftermath became a mirror reflecting the deep divisions within American society over the morality of the Vietnam War itself, leaving a scar that would influence foreign policy and military doctrine for decades to come. It established that battlefield actions cannot be separated from human rights, and that the ultimate test of a nation's strength is its willingness to hold its own forces accountable under international law, regardless of the political cost. This shift in military consciousness marked a big, permanent end to the era of unquestioning obedience, establishing a modern standard where individual accountability is paramount, ensuring that commanders could no longer shield themselves behind the actions of their subordinates. Today, the site of the My Lai Massacre in Sun Mai is a quiet, peaceful memorial park. The lush, green grass and gently swaying trees stand in stark contrast to the violence that took place there more than 5 decades ago. Visitors walk past the preserved foundations of burned homes, seeing the names of the 504 victims carved into a black marble monument. The oldest victim was 82 years old. The youngest was a baby of just 1. The memorial serves as a powerful reminder of the human cost of war and the fragile nature of our shared humanity. It also honors the memory of Hugh Thompson Jr., Lawrence Colburn, and Glenn Andreotta, who were finally recognized for their heroism in 1998, when the U.S. military awarded them the Soldier's Medal, the highest award for bravery, not involving direct contact with an enemy. Their story teaches us that even in the most extreme circumstances, one individual has the power to stand up against injustice and save lives. As we look back on this painful chapter of history, we must ask ourselves how we can ensure that such tragedies are never repeated, and how we can cultivate the moral courage to do what is right, even when everyone around us is doing what is wrong. The lesson of My Lai is not just about the failures of the past, but about our ongoing responsibility to uphold human dignity in the face of conflict and division. If you believe that, remembering these difficult truths is essential for building a more peaceful future. Please subscribe to our channel, share this video with others, and leave a comment below with your thoughts on the legacy of My Lai. By keeping these stories alive, we honor the victims and commit ourselves to a world where such horrors are never allowed to happen again. We encourage you to engage with this history constructively, discussing how modern military ethics have evolved to prevent such tragedies. We must remember that peace is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of justice and moral responsibility. Thank you for watching, and join us next time as we continue to explore the complex, powerful stories that have shaped our world, ensuring that the voices of the past continue to guide our path forward into a more compassionate and understanding era.